Thank you, Paige. Hello, everyone. I'm happy to be here. I'm honored to be at the head of this 10-week series. I think that you're in for a real treat in learning much more about Van Gogh. I'm here today to talk about the inspiration of a particular place in a particular moment. The inspiration on the extraordinary vision and work of Vincent van Gogh. The title of the talk today is Van Gogh's Provence. I'll speak mostly about the 15 months that Van Gogh spent in the south of France. I'll talk about his life, I'll talk about his passions, I'll talk about his frustrations and disappointments. Art historians talk about this period in Van Gogh's life as the climax of his artistic career. One art historian says that this 15 months represents the greatest flowering of his artistic ability. In just over 1 year, he painted 200 paintings, he made 100 drawings and watercolors, he wrote more than 200 letters, many of them illustrated, as we will see today. He also wrote voluminous letters, mostly to his brother Theo. If you've read these, you see this extraordinary, intimate portrait of Vincent van Gogh's inner life. He talks about his hopes, his insecurities, his sense of calling, and even sense of mission as an artist. He writes about the figures he admires. These letters sometimes go on for pages and pages and pages. They are eloquent, they're moving, they're honest, they're often raw, and they also convey strong ethical commitments. One striking feature that occurs to me as I read these letters is that he experienced the world as colors, which is to say, all of his descriptions of his surroundings are drenched with colors. And the colors he saw in Provence, he wrote, are unlike anything he had seen in his lifetime. Vincent van Gogh came from the Netherlands. This is a map, and we see just north of Antwerp, we see the small village of Zundert. Let's take a look at another map here. We can see now just above Antwerp a little bit of red there. This is where we place Zundert of the Netherlands. Vincent van Gogh lived in a small village in Zundert in the southern Netherlands. He was born in 1852. He was the firstborn of 6 children. He had 2 brothers and 3 sisters. His father was a Dutch Reform Protestant minister. Vincent van Gogh grew up in the parish house. It was attached to the church. The church had 56 members. This Protestant community was surrounded by a Catholic majority. This was a community that was sustained by agriculture and crafts. The village was poor, life was hard, farming was primitive. The peasants in his village lived on minimal subsistence. Many laborers were without land. There were also uncultivated plots. There was strong reliance on ox-driven plows for grain and potato crops. Many people had to rely on seasonal work. Sometimes it would be harvest, sometimes it would be broom making and basket weaving. No surprise that the population of this small village struggled with poor soil, crop disease, crop failure. And often Reverend van Gogh's church helped the poor members of this community, helped to feed peasants, helped to pay tenancy fees, helped to keep them going in difficult times. Van Gogh's biographers emphasize his early religious formation. They say that this was lasting through his entire life. His parents' Protestant theology was the sanctification of lowly labor, that humble work was sacred, that it was Christ-like. And as we read Van Gogh's letters, we see that this message stays with him throughout his life. He articulates it in various ways. I think, and I hope we can see today, that we can see this message in his paintings as well. The sanctification of lowly labor, that humble work is sacred. They taught their children that the dissolution of the self was important, the dissolution of the self before God, that individuality is not important. They talked about introspection, about searching one's own soul. They talked about self-scrutiny, certainly the love of one's neighbors, and the care for those in need. The piety was not intellectual, it was emotional, it was experienced. It was woven into the fabric of one's daily life. Holiness, his parents taught, was to live in the service of other people. Unlike some Protestant beliefs, the focus was not on a punishing God. The focus, rather, was God as the source of love and of light. The parents in particular taught their children to look for God in nature. Vincent's mother wrote to him in a letter that nature, I'm quoting, is saturated with God's presence. The mother was an artist in her own right. She drew small sketches, she drew small paintings, which decorated this small house where they all lived. She taught her children always to seek God in nature, and she emphasized in particular the shapes of clouds, to seek God in the sunset's array of colors, to look at the hue and the texture of the land and of plants and of trees, and to seek God there. No surprise that Vincent, as a young man, was interested in religion. In fact, he spent a year in a school of theology in Amsterdam when he was 24 years old. He was a believer. Van Gogh in Provence. Van Gogh was in Provence, in the south of France, from February 1888 to May 1889. He had begun to paint in his early 20s. He moved to Paris in 1886, and he spent 2 years in Paris painting and meeting other artists. He shared his conviction with other artists. He found that they had the same conviction, which was that the future of painting was post-impressionist. And so he and others talked about what the future of art would be after the great impressionist paintings. He embraced his calling as a painter when he was in Paris. He also became aware of its costs. A letter to Theo conveys his thinking. Theo had just described in a letter a visit to his parents in Zundert, and this is Theo writing. They are fairly well, but it is sad to see them. Vincent wrote back to encourage Theo to marry, which would make his parents happy. And then Vincent shared his own thoughts. As for me, I feel that I'm losing the desire for marriage and children. And now and then it saddens me that I should be feeling so at 35. To succeed, one must have ambition, and ambition seems absurd. It depresses me to think that even when it's a success, painting never pays back what it costs. He went on. I would like above all to be less of a burden to you. Perhaps I shall take myself off somewhere down south to get away from the sight of so many painters that as men disgust me. And so Vincent set his sights on the south. We see a map of France. We see the map of southern France. We see the port of Marseille in southern France. And now we see highlighted the town of Arles. The destination then is the map. We see on the map is the city of Arles, a city on the Rhone River. We see now an enlargement of the central part of this town in southern France. An ancient city built on the banks of the Rhone River. There's evidence of inhabitants of this city going back 2,000 years. There was a Greek colony in the 5th century. There was then a Roman colony. The city was said, or at least claimed, to have been founded by Julius Caesar in 46 BC. If you visited Arles, perhaps you recognize this landmark. This is a Roman amphitheater, which still stands. This amphitheater built in about 90 AD. It was largely for chariot races, but there were also fights among humans, gladiatorial fights in this amphitheater as well. It defined certainly 19th century Arles, and in certain ways, it defines the city today. And now we can see the situation of the Rhone River. We can imagine, having seen the map, we can imagine that river flowing south, emptying into the Mediterranean. Arles, in many ways, was like a port city, not directly on the ocean, but very near it. People from all over the Mediterranean, sailors from North Africa, sailors from farther east would make their way into the port and then make their way up the Rhone River to spend time in Arles. As one of the most important ports in France, one of the most important ports, along with Marseille in southern France, much of the town's residents were dependent on this river traffic and trade, international trade. Some historians have estimated about 5,000 people, perhaps directly supported by sea trade and river trade. When Van Gogh was there in the late 1880s, it was also beginning to industrialize and showing certainly the evidence of the industry of steel and of shipbuilding. And we see lurking at the edges of some of Van Gogh's paintings smokestacks and smoke and evidence of this kind of modernization. So Van Gogh was in Arles when the agricultural economy was beginning to shift to take on the contours of the modern city. Van Gogh left for Arles in February 1888. It was a 16-hour train ride. It was the coldest February in 30 years in the city. And so he arrived in Arles, a city in the grip of ice and snow. This was perhaps the first painting he painted when arriving in the southern French city. Like so many of his paintings, he described in detail what he had painted to his brother Theo. This particular painting, he writes to Theo about a landscape in white, a town in the background, and then he identifies the tree. He mentions a branch on this almond tree already in flower. And then he says to Theo, the painting encourages me. I'm quoting, he says, "This is much more than I could have managed in Paris these days." When summer came, he was astonished by the colors. This is a painting, Peach Trees in Blossom. Within 1 month of Van Gogh's arrival in Arles, he began what would be 14 paintings of orchards in bloom, all within 1 month of his arrival, all done within a few weeks. This is another painting, orchard bordered by cypresses. Van Gogh also in his letter describes the colors he saw in blooming trees. Listen to the subtlety and the nuance. Again, we imagine him walking through the world, seeing colors. This is in one letter, the language he includes to Theo. As he describes the shades, you will see them here also. He says that he sees in blossoming trees green gold, yellow gold, pink gold, bronze, copper, dull, dark yellow, the color of threshed corn, pale blue, royal blue, the blue of the water, the blue of forget-me-nots. We have other paintings from this early series. Van Gogh's vision in Arles was to establish an artists' colony. He reached out to Paul Gauguin, whom he had met in Paris. He sketched out this vision of drawing artists to a town that had never been a destination for artists, of having kinds of cooperative collaborations, helping one another, perhaps rooming with one another, sharing studio space. And Paul Gauguin initially responded with enthusiasm. Van Gogh himself sketched and deepened the vision he had, that he and Gauguin could possibly find rooms in the same house, they could share expenses, they could collaborate, they could begin the project of finding and elaborating the post-impressionist path together, and in so doing, attracting other artists. He wrote with enthusiasm to Gauguin. One of his letters says that Gauguin could come to Arles, I'm quoting, as an exalted master to be healed and revitalized. And in his early walks through Arles, Van Gogh glimpsed this dilapidated yellow house. His vision took shape as he explored this abandoned, dilapidated house. Empty, at the center of town, this would be the start of the artist's colony, beginning with rooms for him and Gauguin. He sketched the house. Just to compare it, it's a slightly different angle, but you can see behind the later facade built for the Tabac Bar, you can see the house behind there. Then he later painted the house. The rooms were in a terrible state. Van Gogh wrote to Theo asking for money, hoping to make them habitable. Theo, supporting his brother and eventually supporting Gauguin as well, began to send him money. Van Gogh lists what his brother paid for: 2 beds and mattresses, 12 chairs, a small table, a dressing table, a chest of drawers, a mirror, a cupboard, a big frying pan. Later letters: sheets, drawing boards, canvases, paints, frames, stretchers, and then a slightly more sad letter notating what he's asking Theo for money. Eventually, he's writing Theo to ask for money to feed himself. He says that for 4 days straight, I have survived on 23 cups of coffee and bread, which I still have to pay for. Nevertheless, he was eager to tell Theo of his progress. He moved from furnishing and repairing this dilapidated home to starting to work on the bedrooms. He would rent 4 rooms in this house, 2 bedrooms, 2 studios, and he started then to work on a particular bedroom. This is an image of a typical letter. I say that many of his letters are illustrated. They're an extraordinary thing to say, and he's sketching while he's writing. I've translated some of this letter to give us a sense of what surrounds this sketch. My dear Theo, at last, I'm sending you a little croquis, little sketch, to give you at least an idea of the direction this work is taking. Because today I've gone back to it. My eyes are still tired, but anyway, I had a new idea in mind, and here's the croquis of it. Number 30 canvas, once again. In short, looking at the painting should rest the mind, or rather the imagination, and now the colors begin. The walls are of a pale violet. The floor is of red tiles. The bedstead and the chairs are fresh butter yellow. The sheet and pillows, very bright lemon green. The blanket scarlet red. The window green. The dressing table orange. The basin blue. The doors lilac. And that's all. Nothing in this bedroom with its shutters closed. He then begins describing his preparations of the Yellow House to Gauguin. He writes to Gauguin that he has prepared Gauguin's studio, quote, with very deep feeling. He describes the garden that Gauguin's room will look onto, which Van Gogh describes as the garden of a poet. He then sketches a reed, pen, and ink image of what Gauguin will see. This is a detail of the garden. The small park across from the Yellow House was the Place Lamartine, named after an earlier poet earlier in the 19th century. It was the square right in front of the Yellow House. Again, before Gauguin's arrival, Van Gogh painted now a fuller image of this garden. And in a letter, he said that one can imagine poets strolling in the garden. It's a glimpse into his own imagination. One can imagine the painter Botticelli and Giotto, the poets Petrarch and Dante and Boccaccio in this garden. And then he says something interesting in the letter as he describes this garden. He says, actually, this view reminds me of Daumier, which is a really interesting idea. We know Honoré Daumier, again, earlier in the century. He says the view reminds him of Daumier, but if we look at a couple of paintings of Daumier, we also imagine him seeing this view and then depicting in the style of Daumier, what I at least see as an affinity between Daumier's own painting style, strongly influenced by the drawings Daumier did, and the strong outlines, and the less clear features of the face. Gauguin arrived in Arles in late October, 1888. It was clear already that Gauguin did not warm to the idea that Van Gogh had of an artist colony, of closely collaborating, of working together, of forging a kind of alliance. He had no great enthusiasm for living in the close quarters of the Yellow House. He had no great enthusiasm for working closely with Van Gogh as they both elaborate a new style. In certain ways, their temperaments were very different. Gauguin, a kind of visionary, a kind of fantasist, moving away from realism and closer to an imaginary kind of space. Van Gogh rooted in the feel and the texture and the colors as he sees them. What did rather attract Gauguin was the financial support that Theo had promised. Theo was an art dealer. He promised to be Gauguin's dealer if Gauguin went to the south with Vincent. And they came on an agreement in that once a month, Gauguin would send a painting to Theo, and Theo would sell it, or if he didn't sell it, nevertheless send money to Gauguin. Of course, he was still sending money to Vincent. This is from a letter to a friend from Gauguin, describing his purposes for going to Arles just before he left. He wrote to his friend, this is Gauguin, "At the end of a month I will leave for Arles, where I think I'll stay a long time, since the purpose of my stay there is to make it easier for me to work without worrying about money, because Theo has managed to launch me." What was the reality of life then for this pair of artists? The first weeks were comparatively harmonious. The two had walks together. They sometimes set their easels up side by side in a landscape and painted the scene. They sometimes painted portraits of the same person or people that Vincent had met in his time there. Theo continued to send money to both of them. And then after a month or so, the relationship began to sour. It began to degenerate. There were tensions, there were arguments. There was eventually the threat of violence. At the end of one major disagreement, there's the famous self-mutilation of an ear of Vincent after a roaring fight that they had had. Gauguin had planned to stay for a year. In fact, he instead stayed for about 9 weeks. I'd like to focus in the next part of this lecture, though, to talk about the work that Vincent did in the early weeks of this stay of Gauguin and Van Gogh. He wrote to Theo in a letter just after Gauguin's arrival, "This week I did a new study of a sower." This is small. We'll fill the screen in a moment, but if you can make out on the left, you see this sketch. On the left, you can see the sketch of a sower, perhaps. And again, characteristically, an illustrated letter. Taking a little bit from this letter, he's describing the sketches here. The landscape is utterly flat. Again, talking about the sower on the left in that sketch. The figure is small and blurred. And then he makes a painting from that initial sketch. He goes on in the letter. "And then I did another study of a plowed field with the stump of an old yew like this." And he shows Theo in the sketch on the right side of that, the stump of an old yew tree. And then he works that up as a painting as well. This was not the only painting of a sower that Van Gogh did in Arles. In fact, it wasn't even the first painting he did in Arles of a sower. This is among the most iconic paintings of Van Gogh. He had written to a friend he had met in Paris, the painter Émile Bernard, close to Émile Bernard, and he wrote letters as well to him. Not surprisingly, Van Gogh focuses on the colors in this painting. He says, "The sower's smock is blue, his trousers are white, square 25 canvas. There are many repetitions of yellow in the earth, neutral tones resulting from the mixing of violet with yellow, but I could hardly give a damn about the veracity of the color. Better to make naive almanac pictures, old country almanacs where hail, snow, rain, fine weather are represented in an utterly primitive way." And we hear him and we see him forging this kind of new vision, post-impression kinds of views toward veracity, prominence of color. He continues, "I don't hide from you that I don't detest the countryside, having been brought up there. I have snatches of memory from past times, yearnings for that infinite of which the sower, the sheaf, are the symbols. These still enchant me as before." This was in June 1888. We have here an illustration now of the letter that I've read from, and we can again see the sketch, and we can see then what he does with the sketch to turn it into this particular landscape. And we now see other versions of this vision of the sower. I think the fact that Van Gogh returned to this subject again and again is a window into his deepest convictions, both of human worth and the value and role of art. We remember his upbringing. We remember the words of his mother who said that we should look for God in nature, in the shapes of clouds, in the sunset's array of colors, in the hue of the land, in the plants, and in the trees. We remember also the conviction that the humble laborer working the land was of the highest human value. Van Gogh was familiar with the writings of this man from the Netherlands, Allard Pierson. The Reverend Allard Pierson was a Dutch theologian. He was a historian, he was a minister, and he was a scientist. And when the University of Amsterdam opened in 1877, Allard Pierson was appointed professor of art history and professor of modern languages. He was a deeply spiritual man, and also he was a wholly modern man. He believed, for example, that nothing in the Bible should be accepted if it could not be scientifically proven, at least speculatively so. So that's an interesting combination, both deeply pious and deeply modern. Van Gogh knew the theological works of Pierson. Pierson had ideas about the place of music and art and nature that correspond with what Van Gogh's mother had taught him. Pierson believed that art and music and nature were windows onto the divine. He was very specific about this. He believed that there was not a depiction, not a description, but an intimation or maybe evocation of the divine in the greatest works of art and music. He gave examples. For example, he said, Rembrandt's Burgomaster Jan Six, Titian's portrait of his daughter, Lavinia Vecellio, and this beautiful painting by Murillo, Bartolome Esteban Murillo, The Flower Girl. He said that these, as I mentioned, do not depict, they do not describe, but they do evoke a higher truth. These are some phrases from a book that Pierson wrote in which he tries to explain this. He says the poet, and he would also say the artist and the musician, the poet has a heart for the secret language of nature. He wrote that humans must recognize and revere these connections between our world and the divine world. Pierson insisted that we all have the capacity to hear these intimations and to see these evocations. He said, the poet cannot listen to the sea without thinking of the eternal. The poet cannot see a seed fall on the soil without thinking of the morning of resurrection. Pierson also wrote that humans are certainly capable of ignoring this connection, or perhaps feeling it but rejecting it. And what he called this ignorance, willful ignoring of this connection or willful rejection, he called this poetically the breaking of the string of poetry. Make this string of poetry break in our souls, and the stars will tell nothing more or less than an astronomy book. The spring will bring no joy, and the autumn no longing. When that happens, the well of religious life will dry up. The great sea will be silent for us. The grain fields and the stars and the buds of spring will speak no more. This, I think, is the vision of Van Gogh in those 15 months in Arles. That is, to make the great sea, the grain fields, the stars, and the buds of spring speak. These, as I say, evoke the religious upbringing of Van Gogh's youth. It's also not hard to sense them in the iconic paintings of his time in Provence. This is La Mer aux Sainte Marie. This is the wheat field with the setting sun. And here we see, as I mentioned before, on the edge of this painting, evidence of industry, evidence of modernization of the city. Here are the stars in another iconic painting. And here are the trees that we saw before. Van Gogh wrote, "In a picture, I want to say something comforting, as music is comforting. I want to paint men and women with that something of the eternal, which the halo used to symbolize, and which we seek to convey by the actual radiance and vibration of our coloring. Therefore, rather than the misery he also endured, rather than the disappointment and the bitter end with Gauguin, rather than the violence, rather than his own tragic death, this is what I think we should think about when we imagine Van Gogh in Provence." Thank you. Thank you. So I've left some time for observations, shared observations, perhaps questions, perhaps a little bit of discussion. I think that there are a couple of mics that will be going around. Love to hear from you about your thoughts about what you see and what you hear here.
Thank you very much. That was a wonderful lecture, really inspiring. Couple of questions. One, wondering where all of those orchard paintings are, if they're in one location or if there's one location where there are many of them. And did Theo represent Vincent during the time of his painting here, or when did, I guess, Van Gogh's paintings become purchased by people and admired by people?
Yes. I hope there are people here who could answer that question, because I don't have knowledge about the distribution of these paintings. Theo certainly supported Vincent and supported him financially and distributed paintings also. I don't have a clear sense of the timeline of that. But I'm wondering if there might be a curator of this exhibit or someone from the museum who might enlighten us more about this question. Good question.
Jim, no problem. It's Katie. Vincent was sending the bulk of his artwork to his brother Theo in Paris. It was an inventory that Theo shared with other artists and with art critics in Paris. So Vincent's work was seen by more people than one might imagine. He also was invited to contribute paintings to exhibitions in Paris and in Brussels where his work was seen. And he made the one sale that he made in his career. a painting now in Russia sold to a woman named Anna Bach for 400 francs. So he really was funded by his younger brother.
I was just wondering where Theo got the money to support his brother and the other artists, since he grew up in the same semi-poverty as Van Gogh himself.
Kate, can you answer that question?
Theo worked for the art dealers Boussard and Valadon and was quite good. So he had money for his own rent and cost of living in Paris, and then also supported his brother with his rent and cost of living and art supplies in Arles. And Vincent saw that as a professional arrangement, in that he was receiving a stipend from his brother in exchange for providing his art to his brother, which wasn't selling in the moment, but he had great ambitions that that day would come. That day came after they both died, unfortunately for both of them. However, it was Theo Van Gogh's widow, Jo, who's responsible for selling Van Gogh's work and getting it placed in important exhibitions to bolster a legacy that was already beginning in Vincent's lifetime. There's a great book about Joanna Van Gogh in the gift shop of the exhibition if you're interested in knowing more about her.
Hi, I'm very curious about the breakdown of the relationship between Van Gogh and Gauguin. And if he wrote about that with Theo, is there anything you can share with us in his letters that that he shared with Theo?
Yeah, I think that, I think the reasons for Gauguin coming, Gauguin is pretty explicit about. And I think that, I don't know how realistic Vincent was about his enthusiasms, and he just became more and more convinced that this would work. I think that Gauguin, in a sense, felt trapped in a way and felt very, very uncomfortable on what the assumptions that Vincent had about that. At certain points, Vincent writes to Theo about Gauguin pressuring him to go toward more and more abstraction, which is the direction in this kind of symbolist or imagined space that Van Gogh was moving in. And that was the subject of that particular fight that they had when Gauguin left and Van Gogh mutilated his ear. Obviously, Van Gogh was suffering from some sort of mental estrangement also in these periods. So I think it was fundamental personal incompatibility, but also fundamental disagreement about the future of art, and then this kind of clash finally.
Hi, sorry, I'm from the Netherlands,
Yes.
and I'm very proud of this artist, but I do wonder, like, how many French people joined him, because the artists usually in the Netherlands, they were together, and so the idea of this house was great, but I don't understand, did they actually come to Van Gogh in this house? And did they share paint costs, for instance, like the Dutch do?
No one other than Gauguin joined this artist colony, so, and that was sadly very brief as well.
Thank you so much. That was a great lecture. You mentioned briefly that music was a great influence for Van Gogh when he painted, I'm guessing throughout his life, but especially here in this period. Is there any writing to Theo or in his diaries or himself about the type of music that he would enjoy during this time, whether it will be classical or opera or any specific artist that he musically at the time that he admired? Mm-hmm.
I'm not thinking of any, actually. I think about the sort of the references that Van Gogh comes back to again and again, which are really interesting and revealing of the same sentiment, namely of what artists, what creative thinkers are intimating or evoking the divine in the way that echoes with Pearson. He goes to writers and he goes to novelists when he describes this to Theo. Unlikely combination maybe, but he begins with Harriet Beecher Stowe, actually, in Uncle Tom's Cabin. And that's a person, again and again, he'll say, intimates what it is to be Christ-like. He talks about Jules Michelet, who was a French historian in the 19th century. And Michelet was a politically socialist, socialists understood at the time, not revolutionary communists, but a kind of fundamental equality of humans that through an immense effort of one's own will, one can sort of channel and connect with other people. So that's sort of an interesting notion also of this divine-like community. And finally, he talks about the novelist Victor Hugo, of doing the same sort of thing, that is sketching a fictional world deeply embedded in ethical issues of the workers and of the suffering and of the poor. But I'd be interested, Kate, I'd be interested in the musical piece of that. Do you know if Vincent talked about composers and music in these terms?
He specifically talks about Richard Wagner and Hector Berlioz when he's talking about wanting to make of painting something consoling like music. So when you go into the exhibition in the entry lobby, if you happen to have to queue or if you want to take a moment of pause, we are playing some preludes by Berlioz in that space in honor of his recognition of that artist as someone accomplishing in music what he hoped to achieve in painting.
And what a combination, because Wagner and Berlioz are, you know this, are very different kinds of approaches to music, and Wagner being an internal, inarticulable gush of music that seems never to start or stop, but is continuous, a kind of state of the soul, you could say. Berlioz is very vivid and even visual and very sort of tactile in the music. So that's an interesting combination. But I think without stretching things too much, we can grasp an affinity in what we see with each of those two composers, of Wagner, of an interior state of the soul, and then something very sort of tactile like this image before us with the loaded brush and the heavy paints. I can see that interesting affinity there.
What was the scale of these paintings, and was there much variation in the sizes that he would paint?
Kate, I'm so grateful you are here to answer these technical questions.
Hi again. He typically used standard-sized canvases. He would request a roll of fabric from Theo, but cut them to be standard sizes for stretchers, and then roll them again to send them back to Theo. But at this point in the late 19th century, you could get pre-made stretchers, and they're mostly domestic in scale. When you're in the exhibition in the Gund Gallery, you'll get a sort of sense for the range of scale that he used, sensitively using quite petite canvas size when painting an infant, and a grander painting size when painting a commanding presence of a revered matriarch. And the landscapes tend to be roughly similar in scale to what you think of if you're thinking of French Impressionist painting. They're using the same standard sizes. So when he makes reference to a number 30 canvas, as Jim was discussing in his lecture, that is a standard size for a landscape.
I'm in front here, yes.
What did they do besides paint and complain about each other?
The question is, what did they do besides paint and complain about each other? Vincent spent a lot of time in nightlife, and he spent a lot of time in cafes, and I didn't include this. He spent a fair amount of time in brothels as well. And I think he was all consumed in his art as well.
We've got another question back here. Hi. Why do I really feel like he has as much life in his landscapes, but his trees, as he can in some of the portraits? I keep going back to the works on paper of the roots in the swamp, and it just, I know it's forefront, but it's just, I just feel there's so much life in that.
I agree with you about this, and I'm you will have gathered I'm not an expert on Van Gogh, but I have been reading a lot of letters and a lot of books about Van Gogh, reading from people who have thought a lot about this, and when I came across an article about Allard Pearson and reading about his upbringing, it all, for me at least, it all kind of fit together, and so I think that what you're describing, in which nature seems so full of life in a way that grabs us, that makes us grasp that. I think that's why that made so much sense to me when I read about Allard Pearson and reading about not just nature having signs of the divine, but artists can do that too. And I think that's kind of extraordinary. Each of us has our own views about these things, but I think there's something there, really.
Great. Well, thank you all for coming. Do we have one more?
It looks like there's one more question here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
Just wait for the microphone.
Yeah, the microphone is on its way.
When you describe his period during this time of life, he seems, and with his upbringing, he seems incredibly aware of his surroundings. Was living there particularly what brought his sensitivity towards his surroundings, or is something that he had always had and explored before? Mm-hmm. Is the one question. And the second question that I have is, for someone who had mental illness, supposedly, it seems incredibly lucid to be able to do this and produce these works of art.
So the question is about someone being extraordinarily aware of his surroundings, which is so palpable in the images that we see. Someone who struggled with mental illness, who depicts this so lucidly. And reading, especially the letters, and being so struck by, as I say, walking through the world, and he sees colors, and such nuances in colors, it makes me again realize what we all realize, is that we can't assume how we see the world, and I mean concretely see the world, is how other people see the world. And so I don't know about the nature of his mental illness. There might be people here who do know, but I sometimes wonder, did he see the world differently from the way I see the world, at any rate? And maybe that's relevant to your question as well. Thank you for your good questions. I've enjoyed this. Thank you for being here.